So Matt and Amy are out of town. Of course, Mary Ellen's not feeling well this evening. And, of course, Tina and Kelsey are out of town. Tim's out of town. This goes on and on. But anyway, we're glad everybody's here tonight. All right, I'm going to have to do a little bit of review from last week. We read, I want to say, probably down through verse 24 somewhere. We probably finished that section in 15 through 28 that we read last week. We didn't get through all of it. But for those who are not with us, this is one of those chapters in the Bible. Of course, there's the parallel over in Luke that is so widely misunderstood, and it's created so much false doctrine. It's not even funny. It's amazing how people go into a passage, and the reason being is because they're not considering the text. They're not looking at what's going on here. And if we remember, one of the questions I asked you last week is, why is it that this passage is misunderstood? Answer being, because the first few verses, people have failed to understand that Jesus wasn't answering one question. Jesus was answering a couple of questions. Let me give it to you because we're answering both of them tonight. Well, we already answered most of one last week. In verse 1 it says, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple." Where is he? Where's Jesus right now? He's in Jerusalem. Okay. And Jesus said to, so they're showing them all the buildings. They're showing them the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." So Jesus is talking about a specific event when the city of Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. We got that, right? Well, look what they did in verse 3. "Now as they sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Well, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?'" What are they thinking? Yeah, they're thinking that, well, when the destruction of Jerusalem, or whenever the city is going to be destroyed, they're thinking, well, that's also going to be the end of the world. That's when Jesus is going to come back. No, it's not. And the sad part is that people think that Jesus, when he goes on and answers from verse 4 through the rest of the chapter, that he's answering one question. No, he's not. He's answering two questions. He said, first of all, I'm going to tell you when the city is going to be destroyed. And then secondly, in the second half of the chapter, I'm going to tell you when the destruction of the world is going to take, when the end of the world is going to take place, when Jesus is going to come back. They're two different events, okay? And last week we went into great detail, talking about, first of all, about what's going to be the signs. And let's see if you guys can remember. What were the signs to look for the destruction of Jerusalem? Okay, so the destruction of Jerusalem took place approximately when, guys?
70.
Okay, 70 AD is when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. You can check that out with secular history. And then, of course, Jesus is also going to talk about the end. When Jesus comes back, it's called Judgment Day. All right, he's talking about two different events. Now, we're going to talk about this one tonight to make sure we have the, understand what Jesus taught about the destruction of Jerusalem. But tell me, what did he tell them to pray for and hope for and look for?
False prophets.
Okay, watch for false prophets. What else? What was going to transpire before this event? Remember, he gave them a lot of different things. Rumors of wars, earthquakes, famine, right? He talked about that. Did he give them some information as far as a timeline when that was going to happen?
Yeah, verse 34 says, "This generation
Look at
see
it.
this."
I love that. I'm glad you remembered that, Brian. Verse 34 of Matthew 24 says, when Jesus was answering this question, well, when's this city going to be destroyed? When's this temple going to be destroyed? He says in verse 34, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." All what things? Well, the things that he's just been talking about up to that point. This generation. So Jesus is teaching, okay? He's teaching, okay? Where do we put Matthew 24 on this line? Where do we put it? Here or here? Where? Do we put it over here?
After the cross, before that.
When did he say it? So it was before he died, right? Yeah, so Jesus he's talking over here, you know, if he started preaching when he was 30, right, and he died about 33 AD, you know, this is close to his death, Matthew 24, as far as the timeline is concerned. Jesus is still alive. And he's saying that this event was going to happen in the lifetime of some of you, like he's saying right here. Some of you, it's going to come in this generation. Okay. I said this last week, I'll say it again, because we're going to be talking about this event. You know he wasn't talking about this in verse 34, right, Brian? How do you know that? How do you know he wasn't talking about this event in verse 34? How do you know that?
People would be alive, yeah.
What's that?
People would be alive.
Yeah, that generation wouldn't have ended. I mean, how long is a generation? You know, you're looking at a 40-year span, right? We're talking about that time period. So within this time period, he mentioned these things were going to transpire, such as what? We read verse 7. He said, well, verse 6 says you'll hear about wars and rumors of wars. Don't worry, the end isn't yet. Verse 7, nation will rise against nation, the kingdom against kingdom. Famines, pestilence in verse 8. Verse 9, they deliver you up to tribulation. We move down, there'll be false prophets in verse 11 and deceive many people. And then we got into this section last week as our time was running down. We were talking about, in verse 18, let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Is he talking about the end of time there?
No.
That's kind of silly. You know, if he's talking about the end of time, oh, listen, don't go back to that. You're not having the end of time. You're not having time for anything. He's going to come in the twinkling of an eye, right? He's going to be quick and fast. And so he wasn't talking about the end of time. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem here. When the temple was going to be destroyed, don't go back. And he also mentioned in verse 19, woe to those who are pregnant. Woe? What would that have to do with the end of time if you're pregnant? Nothing. What's that got to do with it? Woe to you if you're pregnant if Jesus comes back. Seriously? It's got nothing to do with it. He's talking about destruction of Jerusalem. Why? Because when you have to flee, it's going to be tough. He said in verse 9, also he said, those who are nursing babies in those days. Verse 20, and pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. What's this flight business that we talked about? What's this flight business? What?
They flee
From what?
from the
Destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah, when the Romans come in here and utterly destroy this city, he says, you want to hope that you don't flee, that it's on the Sabbath. Well, we know he's not talking about the end of time. Boy, you want to hope the Lord doesn't come back on a Saturday. He's not talking about that. And of course, there isn't a Sabbath over here now because, you know, that's under the old law. What were you going to say, Brian?
You can't flee judgment.
You can't flee judgment. I love that. I love that line. Makes for a good sermon title. You can't flee judgment. All right, that's good. Yeah, you can't flee. You can't run away from this. Here, he tells them, don't run, don't go back to the house because I want you to flee. Flee to the mountains. Try to get away from this destruction that's going to transpire. And so I think we can clearly see as we go down there, and again, we hadn't quite finished. Verse 22 was, and unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect saved, those will be shortened. Now we know he wasn't talking about the end of time here because there are some people who are going to still be alive who won't suffer the death and destruction that's going to happen when Rome comes in. He says, unless those days are shortened. And really what he's talking about there is that when the Romans decided enough was enough. Okay? And it's a good thing they decided that, because if they hadn't decided that's enough destruction, there wouldn't have been one person left alive. And that's what he was talking about there. And he said in verse 23, then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there, don't believe it. For false Christs will arise, false prophets will rise to show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. Those that are faithful. See, I have told you beforehand. In verse 26, therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there will be eagles gathered together. Even in verse 27, I think he's even making reference to the fact that, look, Not only is this destruction going to be swift and going to be sure, I believe in even in verse 27, he's alluding to what he's about to be talking about. That the Son of Man, he's coming. Jesus. What do we call this? We call it the second coming, right? What else do we call it?
Day of judgment.
Day of judgment. Okay. All right. And the end, as he referred to in this chapter. When will the end be? And so he refers to this. And I want you to keep that in mind because we have already discussed, it's very important because we're going to get to a passage of Scripture that I can remember as a young preacher. I thought, man, that's really difficult to explain. Of course, now that I'm old and gray, I'm like, it's really not that difficult. If you just remember what we have studied in the past about the end, right? Because when we study about the end, we learn that Jesus is going to come. Remember the John passage? We discussed this in the Life of Christ study already. John chapter 5 said, who's going to be raised first at the end of time? Okay, so First Thessalonians chapter 4 says the dead will rise first. And from John chapter 5, which dead are going to rise? But in John chapter 5, verse 28 and 29, who's going to rise? Those who have done good and those who have done evil. So the good and the bad will rise, and then we which are alive will rise and meet the Lord in the air. And that's 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And the only reason I'm bringing that up is that we're going to get into this reading. I know I'm talking rather fast because we've got a lot of material. We're going to finish this tonight, guys. The second question within all of this, to clear up that, let's not mix them up, because this is what religious leaders are doing. They get in the pulpit and people are preaching. Anybody ever hear the rapture? I'll tell you where they get the concept of the rapture. Is they have that idea, they go to this passage, they try to go to other passages. By the way, where is the verse that says about the rapture? Doesn't exist. It does not exist. Because their idea is, the rapture is that Jesus is going to come and take the righteous, right? And leave the unrighteous here. That's not in the Bible, but anyways. But the point is, this passage, this chapter is a breeding ground for that. And so that's why I wanted you to get a clear remembrance of what we talked about, of what happens at the end. He's going to come like a thief. There are not signs, because that's what people are trying to, that's how they scare people today. Religious groups will tell people, oh boy, there's some things going on in the news. The end is near. I think we're coming close to the last days. When are the last days? We've been in the last days since Acts chapter 2. Okay? Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. God has spoken unto us in these last days by His Son. And so, these guys, when they started preaching from, Acts 2 on, that's when the Holy Spirit came upon the apostles, they're preaching that you need to be ready for when the Lord comes back. He could come back at any time. Mark, you had a thought before we get into our meeting.
I was going to say, I know back home, there's a lot of dear friends of mine. Every time that there's a saber rattling in the Middle East, is this the rapture?
I know it. I mean, or any major event, catastrophe or war. People are always looking for signs. When we get into this next section, I want you to realize, because I want you to list them, the contrast between what Jesus said about this event and what Jesus says about this event. Now, when He answers the other question, remember they said, when will this take place? When Jesus said, not one stone will be left upon another. And when will be the signs of the end? Well, when He talks about this, you're going to see a clear distinction from the two, because one of the things I want you to notice is He tells them here to look for signs. He tells them over here, there isn't any signs. Okay, basically. There's nothing you can do. And so there needs to be preparation. All right, so let's get into it. We've covered all of that. Now we're in verse 29 of Matthew 24. I'm going to get you guys to do some reading here. Why don't we break it up? Because we're eventually going through verse 44. So why don't we first read 29 through 35. 29 through 35. Janet, why don't you start us off? 2 verses apiece, and then we'll talk about that before we read the last section, which will be 36 through 44.
Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory.
And he will send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near.
Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away.
All right, so you had verse 34. That's crucial to all of this. Even when we read a moment ago back in verse 27 and 28, even if Jesus goes back and alludes to this, his still focus at this point is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, because he's saying these things are going to happen in this generation. All right, hearing all these things and hoping you don't have to run and flee on the Sabbath day, and hoping you're not pregnant and nursing a baby at that time. Don't go back to your house, just run. We know that clearly he's talking about when Rome comes in and utterly destroys the city of Jerusalem. Okay. And obviously there's going to be some similarities between the two if Jesus is talking about destruction. Is there going to be destruction at the end of time? What kind of destruction is going to be at the end of time? Can you give me a passage? 2 Peter. Let's turn over there quickly, okay? I want us to see this so we can understand why Jesus would, allude to it and go back and forth. In 2 Peter chapter 3, 2 Peter chapter 3, again, he was talking about the end of time. He says in verse 9, the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise. The elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and its works are in it will be burned up. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness? What happens to the world when Jesus comes back? Why? Nobody's here. It will have served its purpose. It was temporary. I mean, the ultimate plan that God had an eternal plan, right, before the world even began. Salvation. That ultimately his Son was going to come, and that's Ephesians chapter 1, by the way. I'm not making this up. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 3 and 4. God had a plan in mind before the world even began. Okay? And so it was there in case Adam and Eve sinned. Of course they did. The plan was put into effect. His Son was obviously going to come. And this is all part of understanding the big picture. All right? Now, the world will have served its purpose. But see, there's a big problem. My Jehovah's Witness friends that knock on my door, they hate 2 Peter chapter 3. You want to throw Jehovah's Witness for a loop? Say, can we look at 2 Peter chapter 3? Because they'll go there, well, that really doesn't mean what it means. And the reason why is because they want the earth to stand forever. They'll have pictures of the lion and the lamb together, and that God wants this world to be here forever. No, he doesn't. And it's not part of his plan. We're going to leave. And if Jesus comes back, that's the sad part. Why would the world need to be here if Jesus comes back? The righteous and the unrighteous are raised, and all that are alive will rise. It's Judgment Day. It's the second coming. We leave. There's nobody down here. It will serve its purpose. And we need to see that. And that's what he's wanting us to understand. Again, getting back to verse 29, he's making reference to here. He says, immediately, in verse 29, after the tribulation of those days. Did you see that? How long did the destruction of Jerusalem take place? Was it an hour? How many times do you hear about the end of time, right? That day, that hour when Jesus comes back. But this destruction took days. So they were there, and they were, the suffering of them running away, it included more than a day is the point. And so he says, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give light, the stars will fall from the heavens, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. The imagery that is given there is basically describing the ultimate destruction that was taking place. You have people letting their imaginations run, and they'll use things like, well, there was so much burning that was going on and fire of the city that it darkened the sun, and you couldn't even see light because there was so much smoke in the air. I don't know if it was so much that as it was just describing the utter destruction that actually took place on that occasion. He said in verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with the power of glory. Now, when you say, and then, okay, once this takes place, you go, and then, what's the danger when somebody goes, that's going to take place, and then, what are you automatically thinking?
Right after.
Yeah, immediately, right? We're going, well, that's good, and then, this is going to happen. Well, it's kind of like giving my life story. This is really boring, but if I could say, I got married, and then I lived in Newburgh. Man, there's a big gap there. There's a real big gap, right? I'm just giving you that quick overview. And so there's a lot of things in between the then, when he talks about the Son of Man that's coming, because we're looking at almost 2,000 years later, and he still hasn't come back yet. But that's 2 Peter chapter 9, because we didn't read the first 8 verses where Peter writes and says, there's going to be scoffers in the last day saying, where's the promise of his coming? Because everything is the same way it was when he said he was going to come back, right? Jesus promised he was going to come back. But yet, it's been almost 2,000 years. And of course, he explained, well, one day with God is like 1,000 years to us. He doesn't reckon time like we do. All right, where was I? Okay, so verse 31. He will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one heaven to the other. That's pretty accurate in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, right? Because 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, he talks about when Jesus comes back, he was talking about the righteous. That's what was under discussion. What was wrong? What was going on in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, guys? What did the brethren misunderstand?
That they died or lost.
Yeah, they thought that you had to be alive when Jesus came back. And so Paul had to write to the brethren at Thessalonica and specifically say, listen, just because they died, they're not going to miss heaven, But he was saying, look, the righteous will rise. And so that harmonized with it. People say, well, what about the unrighteous? Well, there's a lot of passages that talk about the fact that the unrighteous are raised too, because there's accountability. Just go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and he talks about that day of judgment, how everyone's going to give an account for what we have done, whether good or bad. Look at verse 32. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branches has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near. See what things, guys? What do you think he's talking about there? The things we just talked about as far as the signs. He's looking. Hey, Mark, you're a farmer. Do you kind of know when the trees down there on the farm are going to bear fruit? Do you get an indication?
Or it starts to swell.
Are they bearing fruit right now? Are they even close to bearing? See, so you'd probably relax. I don't have to harvest right now, because you see that, right? But you know, you can see, and that's what he's saying. He's saying to his followers, he's saying, look, open your eyes to the signs that are going to come. Because if you do that, or if you don't do that, you'll be destroyed. Because Rome's coming in, and you need to save your lives. And so that's why he talks about this parable and wants them to beware. It's at the door, verse 34. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass till all these things take place. So how would you feel if I told you Jesus is going to come back in your lifetime? What would you do, Dan? It's going to happen in your lifetime. I don't know when, but in your lifetime.
Make sure I was ready.
You would be even more so, right? Because right now we don't know if he's going to come back in our lifetime. Could, and we should prepare. But if you're actually told he's coming back in your lifetime, man, you pay attention to that. Well, that's why Jesus brings it up. Look, he's saying it here, but in that time frame, it's going to happen. They just didn't know exactly when. We're looking back. We know when the date was because we look back at secular history. We won't know when it took place. And so heaven and earth will pass away, but my words by no means pass away. So listen to what I'm saying. Okay, now let's look at this passage. Okay, 36 through 44. Who read last? Oh, Trent did. So David, Kevin, Debbie, Warren, Tony, we'll see. I don't know who's going to read that many, but two apiece.
But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man.
For as in those days which were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ship. And they didn't know until the flood came and took them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man.
Then there will be two men in the field. One will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one will be left.
Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. How far?
Just one more.
Okay. Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect.
Okay, so we got some contrast in here, don't we? I want us to notice the difference between what he said, and we basically were covering verses 15 through 28 when he told them what to look for. Okay, so I want us to contrast what we read there with what we just read here in 36 through 41 as far as what did Jesus say similarly or different from these two events. Okay, what's the first thing that jumps out at you that Jesus taught about this event? When the Son of Man comes. What's the first thing?
Only God knows.
Yes. So it's at an nobody knows. Nobody knows. Have you ever known any religious groups who guessed? Oh man. I remember being in Nebraska when it was like I don't know if you got that little book. I remember getting it in the mail. 1988. That'll be the end. I don't know if you got that booklet. I don't know who sent it or how many, but the point is, people have been guessing. JWs have guessed. Now, wait a second. I think I've quizzed you on this before. The JWs have guessed in times past and said the Lord was going to come at a certain date. They now have an answer for that. Do you guys remember what it was? What was it? They say he came, but you didn't see it. Or nobody saw it. So they're saying, he came. No, you just didn't see him. Look. What we know is every eye will see him, right? The Lord tells us when Jesus comes back, every eye is going to see him. Now what he talks about here, that hour, not days, remember that's a contrast. After those days, okay, that hour he talks about when it takes place, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Father only. But he compared that event with people to what? What event? What was going on during the time of Noah?
They were evil continually.
But what were they doing is the point. They were doing their everyday things, eating, marrying, just going on, whatever. Like it's like any other day. Like any other day. When do you think, I often think about this, when do you think it started to sink in to the people that were not on the ark? Maybe the first few drops, you're going, well, that's interesting. You kind of wonder when the panic stuck. I wonder, obviously, big panic was when the door shut. The waters are coming up. But the point that he's making here is it going to be the same here? He gave him some signs there. But the point is it going to be the same in Noah's day? Is it going to be the same here? Is my point. Like now. Is it going to be like people are going to be planning their weddings? They're going to be going to parties and doing whatever? Is that what's going to happen before Jesus comes back? Like on the day he comes back? Sure. No, guys, it's going to be a normal day. People think, no, there's going to be all this earthquake and there's going to be so much turmoil. Nobody's getting a good night's sleep. It's just wrong. No. It could be just like today. Just like today. The Lord couldn't come back when you had plans to go to work today, or you went shopping. Whatever it might, you went to the bank, whatever. It's on a day like that. And that's hard for people to imagine that really he could come back like any moment. Yeah, that's what he's saying right here, because that's why he talked about Noah's time. They were eating and drinking and marrying, giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also the coming of the Son of Man will be. It's going to be the very same thing. There was utter destruction. David, go ahead.
So, maybe I'm mixing things up a lot.
Okay, just go ahead.
In Revelation, when there's things like the Antichrist and the abomination of desolation and things like that, that's already happened.
Yeah. Now, in the book of Revelation, remember, the book of Revelation was written, it's one of the last books it was the last book that was written by John. And that book, 3 times in the book, in the beginning and at the end, says, these things must, who knows the answer? These things must shortly come to pass. He was giving comfort to the Christians in the first century, David, because they were going to face such abomination, such tribulation you couldn't imagine. Okay? And the theme of the book of Revelation is, endure to the end, victory is yours. That's what the book is all about. Okay? A lot of highly symbolic language, like the book of Ezekiel, a lot of figurative language. But you talk about a breeding ground for error, just get somebody who doesn't know their Bible and go to the book of Revelation. Whoa, look at this 10-headed beast, yeah. Well, do you think it could have been talking about the 10 Roman rulers and, bringing the persecution upon the Christians in the first century? No, I think it's a literal dragon and 10 heads, and people draw pictures, and you got the devil's tail going all the way from the moon into the center of the earth. And go, is that literal? You see, our Jehovah's Witness friends, they go look at the book of Revelation. You got me started, David. I can't stop. They'll go to the book of Revelation and go, there's 144,000 people. Really? That's literal? Yes, sure is. Well, in the Bible, it says that 144,000 were males who were virgins who were beheaded. And they go, well, that's all figurative. I say, figurative. Literal. See, you get to pick and choose what you want? Of course people like to do that with the book of Revelation. You can come up with any doctrine that you want. But the point is, what I always try to instruct people when they read the book of Revelation, you better know the other parts of the Bible too. Why? Because I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt, when I study with people who claim to be experts on the book of Revelation, I can tell them, look, I might not know what all these symbolic figures mean, but from my understanding of the Scriptures, I can tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean this because of this passage. It doesn't mean this because of this passage, because the Bible doesn't contradict itself. But see, they want to ignore those other passages and just teach whatever they want. It's so dangerous. And so getting back to your question, David, is that it happened. What has happened in Revelation took place, okay? The only thing that hasn't taken place yet, that he makes reference to in the book, the end of time, okay? Which is what we're talking about right now. Now, when he goes on in here, and he mentions after Noah's time, he says this. Now, this is where I was telling you guys earlier. I said, I remember being as a young preacher. I mean, green as grass, lots to learn. Still have lots to learn. I remember this passage because the denomination I came out of, they would show movies. Seriously, you go to church service, they show movies. And I remember seeing this one movie, they showed this, very dramatic, of somebody working in a field. You know, because have you ever seen those bumper stickers that says if there's no driver, all of a sudden the rapture's taking place? Okay, whatever. But see, that's what they think. You know, one guy's driving down the road, he's gone, this guy driver's still there. Or, you know, or he's the passenger and go, where'd he go? That's what they want you to think in those terms. Because they go to a passage like this. Now, there's a difference here. When he talked about the two people in the field, what did he say? Or when you're in the field, what did he say? Don't go home, right? Just run. Why? To save yourself. What he's doing over here is what he's saying when there's two people in the field. We know he wasn't saying the Lord's just going to rapture the righteous. That's where I'm telling you where they get the breeding, you know, this breeding ground for error. They go to this passage and say, see, one is taken and one is left. What Jesus is talking about there, because we already established from these other passages in John 5, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and scores of other passages, 2 Peter chapter 3, is that you notice that the righteous and the unrighteous are raised together. So what's he talking about here when he says, and I'm not going to tell you the answer because you guys know. When he says, two men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other one left. Watch therefore, for you do not know the hour your Lord is coming. What do you think he's talking about in those two illustrations? It's simple. It's those who are ready and those who are not. That's what he's been talking about all along. You know, he's talking about two people. He says, one's ready, one's taken to be with the Lord, and the other one's not. You know, when you think about Judgment Day, and here's a problem we have with our finite minds. We sit there and think, what's Judgment Day going to be like? Well, it's going to be this long line. And I'm going to be at the end of it. I'm going to tell you, Judgment Day can be that quick. Okay? It can be that quick. And so, when the idea of going to heaven or hell, it's that quick. One's ready, one's not. One's taken to be with the Lord and the other one's not. Well, where's the other one? Well, he's here on earth. No, we already read. The world's going to be burned up. The righteous and the unrighteous are raised together. His point is simple. He's talking about those who are prepared and those who are not prepared. That's all. This isn't rocket science here. That's in its context. Now, if I pluck it out of its context and want to say, well, it's teaching a rapture, well, you're contradicting other passages of Scripture that we already made reference to. Was Jesus lying? In John, we've got time for this. Go to John chapter 5. Let me just remind you of this. It's one passage you need to underscore in your Bibles, by the way. In John chapter 5, listen to what Jesus says here. John 5, verse 28. Jesus is doing the talking. He says, do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming, the hour, in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come forth. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. Same time, not separate times. It's not I'm coming to get the righteous, and then there's going to be 7 years of tribulation, and then I'm going to come back again and I'm going to reign on my throne for 1,000 years. That's where they like to go to the book of Revelation, by the way, and they talk about Jesus reigning on earth for 1,000 years. I have begged people who watch our TV and listen to our radio, And even when our services are streamed, I beg people, give me one verse that has Jesus setting foot on earth. There isn't one. Yes, Jesus is coming back. And the 1 Thessalonians 4 passage says, we rise and meet him in the air. Judgment will take place. Jesus isn't coming back to set up his earthly kingdom. How do you know that? Because his kingdom's already here. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 13, when anybody becomes a Christian, he says he's translated into the kingdom. We're in the kingdom. It's here. The kingdom, the church, they're one and the same. It's that spiritual body. And you guys know what every kingdom needs, right? What does every kingdom need? 1?
A king.
2? Subjects. 3? Laws. 4? Territory. Right? Every kingdom needs that. And that's why when Jesus told Pilate, my kingdom isn't of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, what? Then when my servants fight. It wasn't a physical kingdom, it was a spiritual kingdom. These are basic fundamentals. And man, I just wish people could understand and apply, because it would clear up a lot of misunderstandings. But a lot of times when you're teaching people, you have to unteach them before you can teach them. And that was me, because I had so much garbage, I had so much baggage. If I just had it's like an artist, you know. If you got a clean, it's like me. I like to write on here, but wait a minute. I'll go, let me clean this up first. I'll clean this up, and now I got a clean slate, and now I can just write on here. But see, to me, I had stuff in there. And that's what you read about in the New Testament, because a lot of these Jewish Christians brought baggage with them, didn't they? A lot of baggage. Judaism. And a lot of the New Testament was written to tell them, look, we're not under that old law anymore. And so they brought baggage. So that concept is not something that I have invented here. So he went on to say, and we're going to finish this. I got 2 minutes. He says in verse 42, watch therefore, for you do not know what hour the Lord is coming. Does that apply to you and I today?
Yes.
Are we watching? How do you watch? Do you sit outside and go like this?
No, you just...
How are you watching? How are you doing that? All right, so you're talking about walking in the light, right? You're talking about being faithful. And if you're not unfaithful and you got something to correct in your life, when should you take care of that?
Now.
Right this moment. Why the urgency? The Lord hasn't come back in 2,000 years.
Could come back.
But he could come back. That's the point. And that's pretty powerful. And then he says, okay, I'm out of time. But know this, that if the master, okay, now we talked about the master of the house. If he'd known somebody was coming, he would have prepared ahead of time. And so let's you and I make sure. Thank you for your comments. Lord willing, next week, Old Testament. We start.
I'm gonna come by.
Yeah, they've got a lot of leaves. And I can tell the rest of them.
How's it good? You guys get your irrigation?
I think it's shut off, but the water's not. It was a water. It's like, are they blocked up?
Oh,
Yeah. Because it's going into another month.
oh, yeah.
It's like, are you doing this on purpose?
Yeah, that ain't right.
Yeah, that's not right.
Oh, yeah, I'm hoping to.
So there is a global warming.
What's that?
So there is a global warming.
I heard somebody out here yesterday. Was that you? I just wore that same outfit.
Healthy. What's Jane?
Janet's like 7. Janet's not
Good evening. Good to see everybody out for our midweek study. Pretty good attendance considering how many are also out of town. Go ahead and mark your songbooks, number 544. 544, we will be singing that in a few moments after Dustin delivers the invitation tonight. After you have turned 544, flip back to 404. We will sing that one now. 404. Looking to thee. Looking to thee from day to day, trusting thy grace along the way, knowing that thou wilt safely keep all that is done. Sure of thy soul's redeeming love, sure of a crown of life above, singing thy praise I press along, Savior divine. Looking to thee, trusting thy grace, I am as happy as a true soldier can be, nearing my own heavenly place. Trusting thy love I press along, looking to thee. Looking to thee for all I need, finding in thee a friend indeed. All the burdens of the day meekly I bear. Neither the foe nor storm I fear, Savior divine, for thou art near. Ready my cares and troubles all freely to share. Looking to thee, trusting thy grace, I am as happy as a true soldier can be, nearing my own heavenly place. Trusting thy love I press along, looking to thee. After a while in heaven bright, where there is neither sin nor night, I shall behold thee face to face, Jesus my own. Then with the loved ones gone before, I shall with rapture more and more praise thee forever near the bright, beautiful throne. Looking to thee, trusting thy wonderful grace, I am as happy as a true soldier can be, nearing my own heavenly place. Trusting thy love I press along, looking to thee. Song of Invitation, 544.
I invite you to take your Bibles out and turn to John chapter 15. John chapter 15, I'm going to be starting in verse 12 in a moment. And this might sound familiar. I know that I've used it when I've led the Lord's Supper, and I can't remember if I've used it for an invitation or not, but it's a really good passage, one of my favorites. So if this sounds familiar, I'm sorry, but it never hurts to go over things again every now and then anyway. So we call this the invitation time. You know, it's time set aside for anyone who's not a Christian to have the opportunity to become one. If you are a Christian, we have the opportunity to make your life right with God and, you know, repent and have the support of those here. But why would you do that? Why would you become a Christian? Why would you repent and get rid of your sin in your life? Well, you know, there are many reasons that we find in the Bible, but I want to read John 15, verses 12 through 17 here, and Jesus is going to give us a couple of reasons on why become Christians. So starting in verse 12, it says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. These things I command you, so that you will love one another." And just a couple quick points from that Jesus makes. So the first one, we are no longer servants but friends. And just simply, that's a much greater relationship that we have with Christ because of that love. And then secondly, he chose us so we can go and we can bear fruit. And it feels good to be chosen. It feels good to have a purpose. And as a Christian, we do have a purpose. We go and we serve God and do his will. So just to close tonight, a couple quick things there on why become a Christian. And being a Christian is not something that we have to do in this life, but it is something that we get to do. It's something we get to do, and that allows us the opportunity of heaven one day. So if you need to make your life right with God, we offer you this time. If you need to become a Christian, we offer you this time as we stand and as we sing.
Love to proclaim it, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed through his infinite mercy, his child and forever I am. Redeemed, redeemed, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed, redeemed, his child and forever I am. So happy in Jesus, no language my rapture can tell. I know that the light of his presence with me doth continually dwell. Redeemed, redeemed, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Redeemed, redeemed, his child and forever I see in his beauty the King in whose law I delight, who lovingly guardeth my footsteps and giveth me songs in the night. Redeemed, redeemed, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Redeemed, redeemed, his child and forever I am.
Dustin, for his invitation tonight. You were in the adult class, and we spent a lot of time about the necessity of having ourselves prepared. As Dustin called out, passages he read, it's certainly encouraging to see that God is likewise well prepared for us. This being the midweek, again, good to see everybody out tonight. As Chuck mentioned at the start of the class, we have several families away from us. I know in addition to everyone that was previously mentioned, Dave called me up today, told me he was also at work tonight. We have other things that we need to make mention of before we close, Chuck.
Sandy just mentioned that Stacy's home with Joe tonight. He had surgery on his hand today, so she was home.
Be mindful of Joe and Stacy as well, Mark.
Yeah, we'll be out of town this weekend.
And Tony's got surgery next week. Wednesday.
What thoughts? Okay. As always, good to see everybody out. Thanks especially goes out to all of our all the various Bible class teachers and the work that goes into that night tonight. Chris Barron was listed for the closing prayer. Obviously, he is not here this evening. Mark, would you mind wording our closing prayer for us tonight?
Father, we humble ourselves before you. Thank you. You again for the privilege we have to come and quiet this place, to set the cares of this life aside, Father, and to study your word and to think about its truths in relation to our lives. Help us, Father, this night to think about the time that when Jesus will return, and that as we study tonight, there will be no advance warning. It will be as we study just like any other day. Help us, Father, to be busy preparing for that. Knowing what we know, Father, to miss heaven is unthinkable. So please help us to take it serious in the way that we live our lives, the things that we think, the things that we say, and the things that we do. Help us to bring these things into subjection to you. We pray, Father, that you grant us another day, that we will be better servants tomorrow than we were today. We pray for your mercy on our souls. We thank you so much for the wonderful Savior Jesus. We make this prayer in his name. Amen.
That was a short. No. Still can't spell.